To me, in my heart, you're the definition of Black resistance. Power to the people. You're amazing. You do all the things. So, what has this theme looked like over time, and what does it look like today to you?
Yeah. I think a lot of what my work and our work largely is like Soapbox, my entity and stuff. A lot of what our work is around like kind of myth busting in a way, or reframing. And so even before we kind of dig into that question itself and what Black resistance, the way I see it as historically, decades ago and today, as these we talk about it is important. Why are we talking about Black resistance in the first place, right? What are we resisting against? And I think it's important to name things, right? So we're resisting against, in large part, global white supremacy in different aspects. So I think when we talk about Black History Month and Black History Year, as I call a lot of ways, there's a lot of like uplifting and love and power and things that are centering Blackness, as it should be and always should be, but also there's a large part of that's like resisting against white supremacy in different facets. And with white supremacy, there's also capitalism, patriarchy, transphobia, all the isms that come with that, all the violences that come with that. And so I won't say it's two parts. I don't really believe in binaries, but I think we need to talk about all those things to be in a holistic manner. And so I think even with that question, it's like we tend to traditionally name civil rights heroes and folks that are always resisting against these invisible apparatuses of violence, and we don't name those things. They tend to be pervasive and still exist today, and we see lots of examples of that. And so one thing I just would, I guess, like implore everyone to think about it is what is not being said in conversations like this, and how do we name those things, very specific language, because with that specific language allows us to challenge and uplift and actually work towards something in a very tangible way, in ways that may be very uncomfortable, in the ways that may bring up other isms that Black folks have, white folks have, beyond that as well. And so I just want to like name that as a framing reference for the whole conversation. But to get to the crux of the question, I think, Black resistance, when I was in high school, I was president of the Black Student Union. So we had like every year, Black History Month, we're always doing events and stuff. And so part of it was, what's the theme, the sub-theme this year? One of the themes was Black history is American history, which is very true. We can't talk about American history without including Black history and our contributions to this country, but also even that's limited, right? Black history is global, right? Black people are everywhere, contributions are everywhere, but we tend to think of it as an American context. We live here, which makes sense in a lot of ways. We have to think about these things a lot bigger and a lot more internationally than ever before. And so I think what it has looked like, we take it from transatlantic slave trade of folks jumping from ships they didn't want to be enslaved, to Nat Turner's rebellion during enslavement, to Black power movements, to Black Summer years ago, to George Floyd 2020, to now tons of movements happening at the same time. We tend to think of those issues against cross institutions typically in the terms of policing, prisons, that's it. And really, we want to lean really into a Black radical tradition. We're thinking of healthcare. We're thinking of education. We're thinking of all the things we know the research says and that our ancestors knew to take care of each other in community, restorative justice, talking to each other, talking about our feelings. All those things are part of a healthy ecosystem for everybody, but especially in like Black radical traditions and Black ancestral traditions, Indigenous ancestral traditions, and really all of everyone's kind of history, but it shows up a lot more so in the Afrocentric kind of studies and thought processes and frameworks. And so I think all that is resistance, even though it is very positive and it's without the other of the enemy. I think there is a lot of like radical movement and work and things we can name, and will probably be named throughout the entire month anyway, that we can point to and are important, but also these things that are centered around love and centered around Black people and Indigenous traditions without even considering the other, considering the violence of the isms, I think is also important as well. So as we kind of start this conversation throughout the whole month, I think it's important to just take all that into consideration the whole time, because it's going to be a lot to chew on for this month and hopefully for the rest.
Ella Baker was was a freedom fighter, and she taught us how to fight.
When we say abolition, we're talking about creating new relationships between human beings.
We want to provide energy and effort into community work, into transformative justice. Prisons and police do not mean justice.
If policing worked, Chicago would be the safest city in America.
Way to cut down on police interactions is to take resources away from them and reinvest those resources in the community.
And then we got a lot of work to do. We got a whole lot of work to do. We got 7 generations of work to do. This system starts from the patrol of slaves and the genocide of indigenous Native people. The Chicago Police Department came the same year as the Indian Removal Act in 1830. Policing as we know it came from the Slave Patrol of Fugitive Slave Act. They did not have a SWAT team until they came to destroy the Black Panther.
And I think that you touched on several things that I know are like, what are those hot button trigger words? So what do we do here in Lebanon? What do we do when we say Black resistance and we say defund police and people automatically get in their head and replace it with, right? But there are some people who, when you say these words, they totally stop listening, they tune out. How can we get them to understand our definitions of the words abolish, defund, Black resistance, enough to have a conversation of what that's supposed to look like for our nation and internationally? I mean, if we're going to go big, right? So
that's always tough. I think, what I thought was great around 2020 from now, not even just the uprisings, but COVID and stuff, was that because things got so bad, people were talking about it, certain movements spawned, and folks who typically weren't provoked in certain ways were. But also, lots of these words got even more politicized, and there were different narratives attached to them that weren't necessarily true. And so there's this conversation of what these things actually mean, and whether it's like in good faith or not. But I want to bring up one example that may be too in the weeds and maybe not. But when I was in Lebanon on the artist residency several years ago, working with Eric Adams, and I met you, Stephanie, and for about 2 weeks or so, I was talking to, I forgot his name, but bus driver there, and I mentioned I'm from Chicago, he's lived in Chicago, and the first question was like, the violence in Chicago, how is it so violent? And I've gotten that before, and so my first, I've kind of trained myself how to answer that. I'm like, yeah, when the mayor closed all these schools, that's a systemically violent thing. Yeah, when they close the health clinics, that's systemically really violent. Like, you're right. So kind of like gear the situation that way towards systems versus like people doing things that are the results of generations of trauma. And so I think when we think about and get caught up in the polarization or the what have been called out buzzwords that get people triggered and charged, I get how that happens. But let's think about stories and how we're all affected by this. I think, Black liberation is liberation for everybody. Queer and trans liberation is liberation for everybody. Into patriarchy helps everybody. You know what I mean? So I think framing in the way of these isms, these violences being abolished or what have you, they help everybody. And so when I think of that as like a lofty kind of bigger thing, when people hear, especially folks with privilege who aren't used to hearing these things, might hear that and kind of scoff at it. When I was talking to this bus driver in Lebanon, we were talking about, Chicago and versus Lebanon, how very different the environments are, but also how very similar they were. He was talking about just the town in general, the socioeconomic status of folks in the town, and the resources like young people had in the town, and that could have changed since then, I'm not sure. But I was like, oh, that sounds very similar to young people I know in Chicago, mainly like Black and brown students in Chicago, very similar to the white students you're talking about in Lebanon. Like, why is that, right? He was also talking about his history of employment from the 60s, 70s to now. He mentioned how himself, I think other folks, lost a bunch of jobs in Lebanon while he was coming to where he is now. And I kind of asked what, give me a decade. And he kind of late 60s, early 70s. I'm like, yeah, I could have guessed that because there was certain policies done on the federal level that took away jobs and took away industry from small rural white towns, as well as urban centers, and put them either overseas or took them elsewhere, paid folks less, and it hurt everyone. White supremacy hurts white people. patriarchy hurts men. Like all these things actually hurt everyone. They sort of finding common struggle is important, and also knowing kind of how much you're willing to give in those certain conversations or certain challenges of trying to reach people. I don't think your job is convince everyone of your opinion or everything is that of something that you think is right. I learned that the hard way, right? But I think finding that common struggle is important. So it's interesting talking to this older white man who does not think the way I do politically. We were like, yeah, we think all these things are violent, all these have affected our communities that look and sound and are very different. We have a lot of common struggle, and our enemies are not each other. They're not. Well, we can understand how capitalism, white supremacy has hurt us all. And it's elite's fault, it's intentional, it's years and decades and generations of intentional harm. And we've always resisted against these things, and we can continue to do that. We just have to pour into each other. And I think language naming is important. If we find that common struggle, we can that can be a starting point to start learning from each other.
So what do you mean by reframing? So when you reframe with your parents, it seemed like you went more global to get them to understand something that you were focusing on. What does reframing look like in a high school level with students as teachers?
Getting folks to understand where they're getting information from and how they're coming to conclusions is super important, right? And getting folks to arrive somewhere versus you telling them something that happened years ago, I think is different, and probably the former is better. And so in a school setting too, I think that's tough because what has been included has been shut out, or why some of the tactics of social change are not in those books. I think a lot of what I struggle with now as someone who has a job and a Roth IRA and votes and like sees a reason to vote locally, especially. We have an election in a couple of weeks in Chicago. In the primaries especially, we open up the textbooks, right? It's mainly about civil rights movement, which again, tons of pros there, also lots of cons, and how it talks about the Black Power movement is a little bit different. And the tactics and how they went about it is often chastised, right? So how do we just think critically about stuff, but you have that critical thinking to what we're being taught in school as well as everywhere else. And so, when we talk about Martin Luther King, so a figure we should talk about often, it's often when there are quote unquote riots or broken windows or anything like that, it's like, what would King do? This is not lots of these frameworks too. Like I want to hone this on Black people, but also bring it out to racism in general, but also get class, gender, sexual orientation, what have you. These frameworks of violences they can translate over and are very parallel to each other in a lot of ways. All happening all at the same time, right? Like no one has just one identity. It's all happening all at the same time. So just as we take away from these months, not only do I understand actual Black history and like factual things that have happened, but also these larger frameworks we can apply to the world, so we can just see the world differently and see how we've been like so conditioned a way that's actually killing us in a very literal sense. But I think again, that's the framing issue of it. It's like we can't start thinking seriously or honestly or with any regard to history or research of how we actually change these things for the better if we're not talking about how to lower the impact of weak relations with community. And I think that is something that can happen sooner rather than later on this long road to what may be abolition or liberation in different circles. And again, we can do that as far as lowering the chances of violence again towards Black people in particular, but like really everyone. And then also build up what we already know works: food, housing, education, just communities of care. Those structures are already kind of there, and I think, and funding is also like something that we can just point to exactly. But it's just like putting forth the energy and effort and capacity to uplift those and amplify those things and prioritize them in a way that is based in a longevity of importance of our society. And that's going to take time to restructure how we raise our children, and restructure how we organize our world around peace and prosperity. It's going to take time, but it's the only way we're going to get out of these horrible situations of increased violence domestically and abroad, and having all of our tax dollars and our energy going to war, militarism in our backyards as well as abroad. Again, let's just take a step back and like, what do we need now as a society, as a globe, to actually do better in the world and create a world that we just prioritizes love. It sounds corny, it sounds cliche, but we're not doing it, and we can if we look to our ancestors.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think you had mentioned earlier this summer of 2020, seemed like more, in my perspective anyway, it seemed like more people started asking that why, like, why did this happen? How is it continuing to happen? And is there something that we can do? Those were the things that rolled around in my head the most.
Colin, I'm totally with you that it's been a really weird time, but I also am left even in the nastiness of it's a hopeful time, because I think those conversations are happening. There's more and more people who are going, oh, wait, what? Than have ever happened before, it seems like. And
Yeah.
so that gives me hope that through this positivity and through action, and to me, that's the message for students, that there is change to be had, right? You're not trapped in the system. You can change the system, because the system in the end is made of people, and people can learn to be better.
Yeah, it's all just people doing things. None of this stuff is permanent. It's all just people making decisions.
Yeah.
And we can make other decisions. You know what I mean?
Say, let my people go. Let my people go. Set my people free. Set my people free. I'm letting my people know. I'm letting my people know. I love you like you and me.